This is the Lamar Valley in northern Yellowstone. The river running through it carries the same name, and right now, willows line its banks, beavers work its channels, and wolves hunt its floodplain. But for nearly 70 years, none of that existed. The wolves were gone, shot, trapped, and poisoned out by the federal government by 1926. Without them, elk herds exploded to nearly 20,000, stripping the willows bare and pushing beavers down to a single surviving colony. A viral film watched over 40 million times claims wolves alone reversed all of it, that they literally changed the rivers. Then, in 1995, something the park hadn't seen in a lifetime happened. This is the Lamar Valley in northern Yellowstone. Today, the Lamar River winds through a quiet basin, but a century ago, this was the epicenter of a deliberate campaign against predators. Under the U.S. Biological Survey and early park administration, federal agents systematically targeted the gray wolf. This was a coordinated, bureaucratic effort to protect livestock and game. So hunters deployed steel leg-hold traps along the game trails. Rangers conducted night shooting patrols. Then came the poisons. Strychnine and cyanide baits were scattered across the landscape, killing entire packs. Outside the park boundaries, a Montana state bounty paid trappers for wolf skins, driving rapid removals on private lands. By 1926, the last breeding pack in Yellowstone was dead. The eradication was complete. Only lone, transient wolves would cross the boundary over the next few years. For nearly 7 decades, no resident breeding population remained in the park. The top of the food chain was vacant, and it was all done by design. Without the wolves, the ecosystem began to tilt. So the focus shifted entirely to the park's primary herbivore, the elk. For decades, park rangers manually managed the population. But then, in 1968, the National Park Service ended its systematic elk culling policy. At that moment, the northern Yellowstone herd numbered roughly 5,000 animals. Now, without predators and with culling stopped, the herd exploded. By the early 1990s, the population had swelled to nearly 20,000 elk. This was an immense ecological force. The elk were not villains. They were simply doing what hungry herbivores do. They ate, and they targeted the winter range valleys, browsing heavily on young willow and aspen. Year after year, the herds ate the new shoots down to the soil. Regeneration stopped. The plants became stunted woody stubs, unable to grow into mature trees. Then, this lack of woody growth hit the physical geography. Without deep roots to hold the soil together, the riverbanks began to weaken. The active Lamar River started to erode its banks, widening channels and washing away sediment. And then there were the beavers. Beavers rely on tall willow stems for food and dam building. With the wood stripped bare, their habitat collapsed. Historically, dozens of beaver colonies built dams here. But by the mid-1990s, researchers could find only one active beaver colony left on the entire northern range. The river corridors were barren. Then, in 1995, something the park hadn't seen in a lifetime happened. On January 12, 1995, a white truck drove through the Roosevelt Arch. Inside were 8 gray wolves from Jasper National Park, Alberta. This was a calculated, bureaucratic operation led by the National Park Service and the Yellowstone Wolf Project. Not a simple ecological reset. Federal wildlife biologists and veterinarians managed the complex logistics. In total, 14 Canadian wolves arrived that first month. Crews carried them to chain-link acclimation pens in the Lamar Valley. The wolves were held for 10 weeks, fed roadkill deer and elk by staff who avoided all human contact. The goal was to let them adjust, keeping them from running straight back north. Then came the next winter. In January 1996, biologists released 17 more Canadian wolves. This is where the historical records show an accounting discrepancy. Educational videos often claim 41 wolves were released during these first 2 winters, but official Park Service logs document only 31 translocated wolves in 1995 and 1996. The 41 figure actually includes 10 more wolves brought from northwest Montana in 1997. So 31 wolves formed the actual Canadian vanguard. And it worked. The wolves acclimated. They were soft released into the wild. Soon, they formed breeding packs, starting with the historic Crystal Creek and Rose Creek cohorts. They reproduced. The population took hold. Now, the northern range had a resident predator. For the first time in 70 years, Yellowstone's elk faced an active threat. No living elk in the herd of 20,000 had ever experienced this predator. They lacked the defensive instincts of their ancestors. Their generation of unchallenged grazing was over. On February 13, 2014, a short online video captured the world's attention. It was uploaded by the group Sustainable Human and narrated by British environmental writer George Monbiot. The title was How Wolves Change Rivers. The video outlined a classic trophic cascade. By definition, a trophic cascade is an ecological reaction that starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way to the bottom. It was a perfect chain of cause and effect. Scared elk, tall trees, busy beavers, and stable rivers. First, the wolves arrived. Then, they hunted the elk. But the video claimed they did something even more surprising. They changed the elk's behavior. Now, the elk grew afraid of the open areas. So, they began to avoid the riverbanks and valley bottoms, where wolves could easily trap them. Next came the vegetation. Without the elk constantly eating the young shoots, the willow and aspen recovered. Some grew up to 5 times their height in just a few years. Then came the beavers. They needed the tall wood for food and shelter. So, beavers returned to the streams. They built dams. And those dams created pools, altering the stream flow and stabilizing the water tables. Soon, the rivers changed. According to the narration, the recovering trees anchored the banks. The channels narrowed. The bank erosion stopped. The rivers even changed course, meandering less and forming stable, vegetated corridors. The presence of a single predator had rebuilt the physical geography of the park, and the story spread fast. The primary upload gained more than 43 million views. It was featured on National Geographic's education platform and distributed in K-12 classroom lesson plans. It was referenced in TED Talks. For millions of people, this beautiful direct sequence became settled science. It was clean, it was satisfying, and it wasn't quite what happened. Now, the real work began. In the late 1990s, wildlife biologists stepped back onto the northern range. For 20 years, they gathered empirical field data. They measured stems, they tracked herds, and they realized the simple, popular story did not hold up uniformly across the park. Because Yellowstone is not a sealed laboratory. It is a porous, sprawling 3,472 square mile ecosystem. No single variable operates in isolation here. First came the weather. During the late 1990s and throughout the 2000s, a severe multi-year drought gripped the region. This changed the rules of survival. It dried up the soil, it reduced the forage, and it weakened the elk herd long before a wolf ever closed its jaws. Then came the other hunters. The viral video focused on a single predator, but wolves were never alone on the hunt. Grizzly bear populations were surging, and grizzlies are highly effective predators of elk calves in the spring. Then there were the black bears, also targeting the young, and the cougars, quietly staking out the rugged canyons. Even coyotes contributed to this multi-predator environment. So, the elk were not just dodging one enemy. They were facing a lethal, overlapping predator guild. Climate shifts, dry winters, and 5 different carnivores were all pressing down on the same population at the exact same time. Now, scientists faced a major problem of attribution. In an open, complex system with so many moving parts, simple correlation is not enough. You cannot look at a recovering willow tree and automatically credit the wolf. Enter the hard data. Veteran wolf biologist L. David Meck pointed out a fundamental problem in the science. He argued that the exact portion of the elk decline attributable to wolves remains unresolved. The cause and effect loop was far from clean, so researchers had to look closer. They needed to track where the elk actually went day and night. Then came the GPS collar research. In the late 1990s and 2000s, biologists strapped advanced tracking collars onto more than 400 elk, monitoring 9 distinct northern range populations over several years. The results shattered the popular myth. The elk did not live in a permanent, static territory of fear along the riverbanks. They did not spend their lives paralyzed in the timber, starving themselves to avoid wolves. Now, the data showed a much larger, active system, and it came down to the contrast between local, brief avoidance and massive, seasonal migration. When winter snows blanketed the high country, many of these elk herds did not stay near the rivers inside the park. Instead, they moved. They traveled down to lower elevations, crossing right over the federal Yellowstone boundary line. But crossing that line changed the rules of survival entirely. Outside the park, the elk faced more than wolves. They faced human hunters. Now, state-managed hunting quotas in Montana became a massive factor. So, the park boundary turned animal migration and state jurisdiction into direct drivers of the herd's decline. This was a multi-jurisdictional event, a departure from a simple sanctuary cascade. The outside hunts directly shaped the population numbers, working alongside winter weather and multiple predators. The wolves were real, the comeback was real, but the story of exactly how it happened wasn't as simple as one video made it look. In 1996, researchers documented only a single active beaver colony on the entire northern range. By 2021, that number rose to 9, and the population was climbing. But wolves did not build those dams. The beavers performed the physical stream engineering. They cut the willow stems, they piled the logs, they dug the channels. So the wolf contribution was entirely indirect. They helped create a condition where plants could survive, but the beavers did the heavy lifting. Then came the hard data on the vegetation. A massive field study spanning from 2001 to 2020 tracked the park's willow corridors, and the results showed a real, measurable change. In some specific stream corridors, modeled willow volume showed a dramatic, undeniable rebound. But this recovery was far slower and patchier than the viral videos implied. The plant growth was highly selective. It was strongest right along the wet banks of active streams. But out on the open range, away from the water, the willows remained stunted, woody stubs. Now, scientists qualify the willow interpretation. The recovery was not a simple, uniform chain reaction. Instead, it depended on a mix of local factors. First, the local water table depth, then the regional climate patterns, next, the shifting abundance of the elk, and the age of the plants, and the specific topography of the stream banks. The cascade was real, but it was localized. It was a site-specific recovery, not a uniform park-wide transformation. For decades, researchers looked to Isle Royale in Lake Superior for answers. On this 2,000 square kilometer island, wolves and moose exist in a closed loop. The long-term study began in 1958, documenting a clean predator-prey cascade. It is a simple, isolated system. There are no other major predators. Human hunting is banned. Yellowstone is entirely different. Now, look at the scale. Yellowstone spans 3,472 square miles. Its boundaries are porous, and the predators are numerous. Wolves share the landscape with grizzlies, cougars, and coyotes. Weather variation, tourism pressure, and elk migration constantly shift the dynamics. Then there is the human factor. Migrating elk face state-regulated hunts the moment they cross the park line, so the Isle Royale pattern cannot be applied wholesale here. Wolves are a real and important part of the recovery, but they are one piece of a much larger engine. Now, the true system is visible. Wolves, bears, cougars, drought cycles, hunting quotas, and human choices all act at once. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they fight. Now, the wolves are a permanent part of this park, and the story has shifted from a dramatic restoration to daily, quiet work. The Yellowstone Wolf Project coordinates this ongoing study. Every year, researchers track the packs, they monitor breeding pairs, they map winter territories, they record natural survival and document human-caused mortalities outside the boundaries. So, the scientific record grows. The packs across the northern range remain steady, changing slightly with the seasons. No more sudden collapses, no more unchecked booms. Instead, teams use radio telemetry and GPS collars to follow these animals through the valleys. The early era of rapid change is over. Now, it is about long-term monitoring, and the research shows a steady balance, far beyond a simple fairy tale. Now, the hard science stands on its own. Every metric, study claim, and archival photograph is fully documented in the sources below. This includes the official Yellowstone Wolf Monitoring Report from the 2025 survey year, which documented exactly 84 wolves across 7 packs. So, the ecological recovery is real. The willow growth, the return of the beavers, the stability of the channels, all of these are factual, but the precise share of the credit belongs to a complex mix of climate, water, human regulations, and an entire guild of predators. The wolves didn't rewrite the whole park by themselves. They just finally got to be part of it again. And now, we acknowledge the decades of field research that brought this true story to light. Now, we are left with a messy, beautiful reality. Because nature does not follow a clean, viral script. It requires a chaotic web of predators, weather, and policy. So, the myth was simpler, but the reality is far more spectacular. What do you think of Yellowstone's true recovery? Share your thoughts in the comments below.